welcome today. My name is Michael Cincotta. I'm the Biodiversity Coordinator out at Trobe Wildlife Sanctuary, and I've been out there for about 25 years now, so pretty familiar with all the local reserves, especially Greswell Forest, Cherry Street and the sanctuary itself. So we're going to take you on a bit of a virtual tour, I guess. We're going to look at a little bit of history, a little bit of an overview of the site. We're going to look at basically what's in terms of not only flora and fauna, but fungi and all the things that live here. We're also going to have a look at the current management. So City of Darebin Bushland Management are currently in charge of that and doing a great job out there, and we'll just look at a few of the issues and threats that they have to deal with. There's a lot of slides to get through, so I'm sorry it's going to be fairly heavy on the talking. I'm not actually looking at the chat, but I will answer questions at the end. So basically, where are we? Cherry Street Grassland is a fairly linear reserve running kind of north-south. And it's in Bundoora. It's right next to McLeod there, just behind Greswell Hill and the university, nestled in. You can see where the star is there on that picture. There's a whole heap of reserves surrounding Cherry Street, which is at the bottom of your screen there. And they're all managed by different people. So that creates a little bit of a challenge in terms of creating habitat flow between reserves and the ability for fauna to move between reserves. They're all managed a little bit differently. So we've got, City of Banyule, we've got City of Darebin managing reserves. There's some reserves managed by Latrobe Uni in there, and Parks Victoria as well. Everyone has their own agenda and they all manage things slightly differently, but all with the mindset of conservation. So the major reserves there are Greswell Hill, Greswell Habitat Link, Greswell Forest, the Wildlife Sanctuary, Latrobe Wildlife Sanctuary, and Cherry Street Grassland. And there are a whole lot of little links in between. Unfortunately, some of those reserves are cut off by cyclone wire fences, so there's not movement from large macropods through all of it. So kangaroos can't really move through the whole system, but there are kangaroos in the Wildlife Sanctuary in Greswell Forest, and there are also a small wild mob which move through mainly through the Habitat Link and Strathallan Golf Course, but they have at times made their way to Cherry Street. They haven't been there for a little while, but it's not to say that they might make their way there again. So there are links, especially for birds and things like sugar gliders and possums that can move through canopy as well. It's a fairly mild climate, like most of Melbourne, around about 600 millimetres of rainfall. We've got fairly cool winters and fairly hot summers. And this means that the vegetation that grows there needs to be quite adapted to these sorts of extremes. And what we find with grassland and grassy woodland plants is that many of them are adapted to really hot summers by being able to store either nutrients in tubers below the surface while the top growth dies off, or they become annuals which are stored as seeds over the summer period. Some are also winter dormant, so they don't grow at all in winter, and that's just an adaptation to that variable climate. Fairly elevated site compared to the surrounding areas, so up to about 95 metres at the northern top end of Cherry Street, heading up towards Greswell Hill there, about 65 metres down the bottom. It doesn't seem to change the vegetation structure too much, but you can notice a little bit of change in the canopy. As we move up the hill, you'll see there are swamp gums tend to dominate the eucalypt canopy, whereas down the bottom it tends to be red gums. It's about 13.5 hectares, so relatively large size, but it's fairly linear. So the issue there being that we've got two really long borders either side and not a lot of really core area, but in saying that, it is quite an outstanding remnant patch of vegetation. Silurian soil origins, it's in the Gippsland Plain bioregion. And the predominant EVC over the whole site is what we call plains grassy woodland, EVC 55, ecological vegetation class. There are pockets of other things. In the north, it merges up into the Greswell Hill type vegetation, which is like a grassy dry forest, and you'll see some evidence of that in the flora. And down the bottom, there's a little bit of a tip which comes in, which is just plain old grassy woodland, but essentially it's exactly the same. The dominant species across most plains grassy woodland is river red gum. However, this site tends to have a bit of a bias towards swamp gum, especially at the top of the hill, because they tend to prefer that kind of drier zone, which is interesting. Being called a swamp gum, you would think that they occur down on the wet stuff, but they like the drier hills. It's pretty floristically diverse. There would be easily in excess of 140 species, and I think that possibly another botanical survey would be useful there, because the data that we have comes from a couple of surveys in 2003 and before, which puts it at about 110 species, but there are at least 140 there that I'm not aware of, so probably more. I threw this slide in just to give you an idea of what's happened in the last 80 years or so. Basically, if you look at the left of the screen there, you can see how open the area was. Big expanses of grassy areas with scattered river red gums, mainly big old trees there. Prior to clearing, it probably would have looked like this area over here near Bundoora Park, with these sort of scattered red gums around the whole district. But obviously there was a fairly intense effort to clear for agriculture at one stage, and then basically most of the trees were removed. Since then, as you can see on the right, the line down the middle basically intersects Cherry Street straight down the middle. And you can see how drastically the vegetation has actually changed in that time. It's much denser. There's a lot more canopy and a lot more sort of mid-story species growing up as well, forming that really dark green look, more like Greswell Forest. A little bit of history. So there is an avenue of honour at the southern end along Cherry Street. Basically, this is a commemorative avenue of honour to planted by returned servicemen in 1919 from the First World War to commemorate their service to Australia. Most of those sugar gums are in pretty good shape. There's a few that are a little bit dodgy, and there's a few that are missing. There's also a row of, you can see on that photograph on the bottom right there, a row of pine trees that were planted a lot later in the 1950s. And basically that was planted by the then Forestry Department to create awareness around pines and their use in potential use in plantations around Victoria. And you'll notice a lot of these plantings around Bundoora. There's some at the top of the Strathallan Golf Course behind Bundoora Secondary College there. There's others around the terraces at the back of the university and various other places. So they were put in fairly prominent locations so people are aware of how good these trees can grow in our climate and environment. The other pretty well-known piece of history for this site is that the old Mont Park Hospital complex, Plenty Hospital, used to be serviced by a railway branch line which ran basically straight through the now Cherry Street grassland, and that's fairly easily discovered if you go for a walk. There are signs escorting you to that location, and you can literally walk along the top of the ballast line. That finished in 1964, that rail line, so fairly recently. Okay, let's go into all the good stuff, the stuff I know stuff about, which is the ecology and what lives here. So grasslands, what is a grassland? Interestingly, the name Cherry Street grassland was derived essentially by local people and local botanists that called an area at the bottom of the grassland Cherry Street grassland. And so this is a small area which really only covers around 25% of the entire Cherry Street Grassland Reserve. So in naming the name of Cherry Street Grassland, it's kind of a relic and possibly should be rethought again, because it really does more resemble a grassy woodland in total, but there are definitely components of grassland there, and there are definitely areas of open grassland throughout. But basically a true grassland really contains mainly just grasses with lots of little herbaceous plants, bulbs and lilies and little ferns and things that grow in the intertussock spaces. And this is an example of a volcanic plains grassland just to the west of Melbourne. Basically, what we're looking at here mostly is grassy woodland, and it consists of these great, beautiful, great big scattered trees, river red gums, with lots of smaller, younger trees in waiting, ready to come up and replace those that fall. But essentially, it's quite open, and we're looking at around about something like 25 metre distance between trees to get that the ground exposed to the sun. So once you've got full cover of or shade cover from canopy, it becomes a forest. So essentially what we're trying to achieve with managing this site is to keep it as a grassy woodland. We've had a big decline in grasslands and grassy woodlands over our establishment here in Victoria. Basically, most of it was cleared for agriculture because it tends to be the most fertile soils. And really, we've only got about 1% of grasslands and grassy woodlands in the protected assets in Victoria. So there's not much left. So everything we have is really important. Out here at Cherry Street, there's a number of different threatened species that we see. Dinella amina, the matted flax lily, that's that picture on the bottom right there. It's a pretty keystone species here. It's something that raises a lot of eyebrows with developers and local friends groups, especially because it's so important. We're really in the epicenter of evolution of this species here. It's listed under FFG, which is the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, and the EPBC, which is a state act, the Flora and Fauna, and the EPBC is a federal act. So it's a very important species. We're basically, Cherry Street Grassland's got about 100 to 140 individuals, depending on what you look at, individual plants. In total, there's about 1,400 known individuals in Victoria in the system. So, we're looking at close to 10% probably of all the genetic material of this species growing in one small reserve. So that's pretty important. Another threatened species we've got on this site, Eucalyptus studliensis, the Studley Park gum. It's actually a hybrid eucalypt between Eucalyptus ovata, which is the swamp gum that occurs right across the top of the site, and Eucalyptus camaldulensis, which occurs down the bottom. And this is a really important stand because it produces quite a lot of small seedlings as well. And it's one of only 2 populations that are actually in a protected system. And then there's a few other visitors that come fairly regularly, actually. So grey-headed flying foxes, everybody knows about these in Melbourne, but they regularly visit when the eucalypts are in flower. Swift parrots, seasonal visitors from Tasmania. I was out there just the other day and saw 2 swift parrots. So, they're here at the moment. And powerful owls fairly occasionally as well, another listed threatened species. So they tend to use the corridors and park up in some of these reserves for short periods of time and then move on. They are pretty serious predators of possums and some of the other birds. All right, let's move on. All right, so let's start looking at some of the fauna that occurs in these sites. So grasslands and grassy woodlands are pretty open areas, lots of sun, lots of warmth, and often lots of rocks. This site doesn't have a lot of rocks because of its Silurian nature, but it certainly has lots of coarse woody debris, which is in the form of basically fallen limbs. And there is quite a diverse reptile fauna associated with those sort of environments. So what we see on this site most commonly, things like eastern blue-tongued lizard and the garden skink, very common as you walk through. But there's also another species here which is less common in Melbourne now, the white skink. Still on site, saw one there just last week, so that's great to see. And very occasionally we get snakes moving through these systems as well. So eastern brown snake is the most commonly found one in our grasslands in and around Melbourne. But others certainly occur here as well. Even though this is a fairly elevated site, quite dry, it does from time to time have frogs moving through it as it's part of the habitat links. And there are species such as the southern brown tree frog, which actually live here all the time. So, you know, most of these things you'll only find by actually looking for them, like under debris. Essentially, they won't be calling. The southern brown tree frog is the only one that will be calling from a reserve like this. On wet evenings usually, but the other two certainly move through. So spotted marsh frog and pobblebonks, these are two frogs that people often find in their garden as well. In terms of birds, lots and lots and lots of birds. Now, I'm going to go through a link a bit later called eBird, which is basically a platform to be able to record bird sightings for anybody, anywhere. Now, when I looked on eBird, there was only 22 species recorded here, so that's pretty pathetic, really. And the reason for that is that there's hardly anybody recording birds here. But hopefully after this, I'll encourage people to do more of it. In grasslands, we often see lots of these kind of birds of prey. So on the top right there, the black-shouldered kite, beautiful charismatic bird that we see in Melbourne above grasslands, often hovering. Basically, they prey on things like small reptiles, small mammals as well, things like mice, field mice, house mouse. But then for the larger prey items like rabbits, which often occur in these systems, wedge-tailed eagles like to clean up this stuff. And we do get wedgies here. I've seen them a number of times over and above our reserve system. Kookaburras, very common. As you can see there, there's one with a frog in its mouth. They're not too fussy. They'll eat anything that moves, anything they can catch. So a lot of birds of prey here, taking advantage of that. Even things like magpies are birds of prey. We get lots of these kind of medium-sized birds visiting as well. So things like black-faced cuckoo shrike, which is a seasonal visitor in summer. The bronze-winged pigeon on the bottom left and the firetail finch on the bottom right, they're both seed-eating birds, so they tend to be, they move in and out depending on what food resources are available. So you often see red-browed finches in summer because they're a species which tend to eat mainly seed from grasses, whereas the pigeons will eat wattle seed and eucalyptus seed. So at different times of the year, they'll be there. A lot of parrots like open woodlands. You can see on the bottom there, the eastern rosella. It loves eating all the different types of seeds and also herbaceous plants. Red rump parrot on the top, it likes these kind of shorter grassy areas, so areas around the long grass where it's mown, and the musk lorikeet at the top there, a fairly regular visitor. And there's lots and lots of smaller birds. Noisy miners on the top right, really dominant species on this site. But you see things like eastern spinebills, spotted puddleoats, just beautiful little birds. Lots and lots and lots of them. And obviously then the nocturnal birds as well. Southern boobook owl, fairly regularly spotted at the wildlife sanctuary along with tawny frogmouths, both nocturnal predators and both present. In terms of mammals, there's not a lot going on out at Cherry Street, but certainly very occasional visits by eastern greys. We've got about 6 species of small insectivorous bat which occur there. An occasional echidna walks through the site. So echidnas are really important for creating what we call micro disturbances, small disturbances on the soil, in the soil profile that allow for regeneration of other plants. And then we've got a few other arboreal mammals, marsupials, sugar gliders, which are now on the site, which have moved through from Greswell Hill, Greswell Forest and the Wildlife Sanctuary, and the ever-present ringtail and brush-tailed possums, which are right through the suburbs. Grasslands are really productive areas and full of lots and lots of invertebrates. There are literally hundreds or probably thousands of species of invertebrates on these grasslands. These are just a few that I just had a few pictures of. But, you know, in high summer, I've seen masses of these spiny orb-weaving spiders right through the grasses. They're all really down quite low, beautiful species. And the common brown, irregular sight. Ants are a very important part of these systems. They're basically the recyclers that they basically do the same thing that worms will do in a moist site, but ants do it in a dry site. About 35, probably more species of grasses on site. The dominant species, this one is kangaroo grass, tends to occupy those areas outside of the tree zones, outside of the canopy zones. It's a beautiful plant. It's a summer growing, what we call C4 grass. And it, again, can become quite dense if it's not managed properly in terms of the fire regime, but where that fire regime is implemented, you tend to get lots of diversity amongst the tussocks. One of the other dominant grassy layer species is the weeping grass, and it tends to occupy lots and lots of space underneath trees or in semi-shaded or sheltered positions. It's a C3 grass. It's a cool season growing grass. But it is a bit of an issue because it can create swards so dense that we don't get much intertussock space at all, and things don't grow in between it. Co-dominant, there's a few co-dominant species, so species that occur right across the site, and there are lots of them. One of them, one of those genera is speargrasses, the stipers, and we've got a number of different species here. I'm just going to flick through a few examples just so you can get your eye in, but basically they've got this long spear-like seed and awn and attachment into what we call glooms, which are part of the seed head, and the glooms are what help us identify different species. On here we've got two species which basically look the same, but the seed on the one on the right is almost as wide as my finger, about a centimetre, a bit over a centimetre wide, whereas the Revoluta on the left, the seed is about half that length. So superficially they look the same, but when you start to look closely, you'll be able to identify different species in there. One of sort of regional importance, the top left here, the rough speargrass, Ostrotipus scabra, beautiful plant, tends to dominate some zones down on the southern area, just around near the Avenue of Honour. So if you have a walk around that area, you'll definitely see this species flowering right at the moment. That photo was taken about 3 days ago. And a couple of other species down there. We've got a wrong name in there. That's Ostrostipus mollis there in the middle is not smooth solenogone. So, yeah. Chilean needlegrass, a very similar grass to the stipers, to the Ostrostipus. There's one really characteristic thing to tell a difference between this and our native plants. This is a noxious weed. And that little thing in the top picture there, right in the middle, called a corona, that little crown around between where the seed and the awn actually meet. If you ever pick a seed out, you'll be able to see that corona quite clearly with the naked eye, and that will indicate most likely it is Chilean needlegrass, a weed. Wallaby grasses are another co-dominant. There's a lot of different wallaby grasses out here. There's at least 12 species that I know of, so much more than has been recorded. They're the sort of fluffy white seeding grasses you see in summer, but very important in terms of biodiversity. They support a whole range of different caterpillars for different butterflies, and other invertebrates as well, and they are quite palatable to native herbivores. Other than the grasses, there are a whole heap of other graminoid type species or grass-like species, lots of little sedges and rushes, little caryxes that don't actually occur in wetlands, but seasonally wet soil. So in winter, when the soil is quite moist, you get lots of these things popping up, become quite obvious, the beautiful lime green foliage of those little caryxes. And the bog sedge on the top right there is in full flower right now, so it's all over the place. You'll notice that. And then they tend to sort of die down in summer. You don't notice them after it gets pretty hot. The lilies and orchids, some of the most obvious species in a grassland. So when you're walking through and things are in flower, these are the things you notice because they're showy and there's usually lots of them. There are around 5 species of orchids and about 12 species of lilies on this site, so quite a diverse, very important remnant site for these species. The 2 sun orchids there, very interesting species in that they have this ability to essentially not open. So they only the flowers only open on sunny days, usually in the morning. They're usually closed by lunchtime, and often you'll only get 1 or 2 flowers opening at a time. And that word at the top there, cleistogamous, actually describes that process of self-fertilisation without opening. So if we don't get sunny days when these flowers have developed, they just won't open and they'll self-pollinate without even opening. So that's actually quite a good adaptation for a lack of pollinators, which means they are actually able to persist in sites that are slightly degraded and where pollinators have been removed because they can self-fertilise. There's a few other orchids on site. The dwarf greenhood, the bushland crew found this a few years ago, which is great because it does occur in reserves around the area, but hadn't been recorded in this site before. So now it comes up each year and they know where that is. So it's a beautiful little species which is pollinated by tiny little fungus gnats, little tiny insects. And a few other orchids. These are really tiny. So we're talking 1 millimetre across, these 2, common onion orchid and the slender onion orchid. Really tiny little orchids, but when you zoom right in, they essentially look like an orchid flower. They are green. They often mass in moistish areas. On the right of the screen there, you can see a species which has been recorded close by in other grasslands. That's something to keep an eye out for. It's a weedy orchid from South Africa. It occurs over at Bundoora Park and a few other areas around this site. So if anybody sees that, please report it to City Darwin or the bush crew so that they can deal with that problem. Very interesting. The lilies, beautiful early Nancy's. These are one of the first things to flower in all grasslands and grassy woodlands. These are finished flowering now. And I'm moving through quite quickly because I've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So sorry if I move too quickly for some people, but Bolbine lilies. So these are beautiful. These are in full flower at the moment. They smell like buttercups. They've got a beautiful fragrance and a beautiful presence. This is many of these lilies and orchids were species that traditional owners actually ate tubers of. They've all got edible tubers to a degree. I wouldn't say they all taste great, but they certainly are edible. This is an interesting local lily, which has caused a bit of conjecture in the past amongst botanists. It's a species that tends to grow on the coast or coastal strip areas and tends not to grow inland. However, it is growing on the site at Cherry Street Grassland, and it was deemed indigenous because there was no way that anybody would have planted it there. There were no plants growing anywhere near here. And none of the local nurseries had ever grown this plant before it was described on site in 2003. So essentially, it's an indigenous plant. It has quite a wide distribution on the site, and it does grow in one other reserve that I know of quite locally. But other than that, it's pretty absent from most of this region. It's a fairly important species for that reason, and it forms a beautiful, tight, dense tussock in a similar way that some of the lomandras do. I find this species really interesting, Donella revoluta. It's one of the most common plants you see in grasslands and grassy woodlands all over the state. It has various different forms depending on where it's growing, but essentially it just forms these great big mats that can be really, really old. So mats like this can actually be older than the oldest tree on site because they just basically grow perpetually forever. And they seed prolifically, but the problem is that the seed's quite difficult to germinate and the plant is quite difficult to grow in cultivation. However, if you've got good populations in intact remnants like this one, they tend to do okay and they still come up from seed all over the place. So that's a good thing with this one. Chocolate lily, one of the local charismatic ones that everybody sees, everybody likes. Beautiful smelling plant. It literally smells like vanilla, I would think, more than chocolate. But you get masses of these in spring, usually around November. And yeah, usually in the sort of semi-shelter positions, but they do grow out in the open as well. Most of these lilies have very small tufts of leaves at the base. So this is why I've got mainly close-up pictures of the flowers, because the leaves don't really look like much. They all look very similar. Milkmaid's another characteristic one of this grassland, comes up again in about November, along with chocolate lily. They're usually flowering together. Beautiful plants. This is an interesting one for the site because this is quite rare right through Melbourne now, the bluegrass lily. There's quite a good population there on site. They're characterised by these sort of twisting flowers. Once they've flowered, the flowers only last one day, each one individually. Then they close up and twist up and form fruits. Same with the yellow rush lily. You can see this one picture at the top right, that twisted flower in the background. But beautiful, beautiful species occurring on quite dry sites, and they flower together. They're often flowering sort of mid to late November into December. And then our matted flax lily. This is a pretty nice specimen, or quite a large specimen with lots and lots of flowers. Can be deciduous. Most of these lilies die down to tubers. This one can also die down to a tuberous type root system, but characterised by fragrant flowers as opposed to non-fragrant with all the other dianellas. And it forms these mats all over the place. And then we've put the lomandras in with the lilies because they're now grouped in with these guys botanically. So Lomandra filiformis, there are two subspecies on site. They're very similar, but beautiful dry site plants with lovely yellow flowers, which a little native bees just love. There's quite a lot of little herbaceous plants. We're looking at about at least 45 species. I'll just go through a few quickly. The sundew, beautiful plants, lovely little carnivorous plants on site, and tend to be in the really undisturbed remnant sites. And then we've got a whole range of beautiful flowering plants. So little geraniums, the bindweeds, really showy pink flowers. The one on the bottom left, woolly New Holland daisy, is now actually absent from this site. I haven't personally seen it there for at least probably 20 years, but it's not to say it doesn't occur there. So if anybody does see that Vitidinia on site, please let the bush crew know, or myself. Dichondra on the bottom right, really common plant all the way through the grassy woodland sheltered zones. On the left of screen, the most characteristic species of this site, or one that we find very rarely around the northern suburbs of Melbourne, is this Stylidium. For a long time, it was thought to be a species called Stylidium graminifolium, and for a while it actually was, until the species was divided up a number of years ago, and it now falls under the species of Stylidium armeria, which is a thrift-leaved trigger plant. This species has these wonderful little flowers that sit well up above the foliage, pink spikes in summer, and are pollinated by little native bees and flies and wasps. And they have this little trigger mechanism where the stamen actually flicks over onto the back of the insect. And you can see in that small inset at the top left there, it's actually being triggered right at that point, and putting pollen on the back of that insect. So on the right of the screen, a couple of little daisies. The daisies are pretty important. We tend to lose them. They're some of the ones that drop out of these remnant patches when they're not managed well, but with the presence of a burning regime, a fire regime, they remain intact. Just some other beautiful things here. The slender speedwell on the left at the top, it forms these sort of loose mats amongst other vegetation, lots of little blue flowers in summer, and the curved rice flower just below it, it's flowering right now. Butterflies just absolutely love that species. It's a fairly rare local species as well. On the right, we've got some contrasting scented plants. So the one on the top, the stinkweed, really does smell quite strong of sulfur when you crush it. It's quite pungent. It's really even hard to work with when you're taking cuttings or growing this plant from seed. And the one underneath it, I think in contrast, such a dainty little flower. That flower is only about 1 millimetre wide, 1.5 millimetres wide, but the scent of it is so intense, the sweet hound's tongue, that you can smell it from, you know, metres away. And if you get right up to it, it's just a beautiful perfume. So I'd highly recommend hunting those out. Common rice flower, top left, another pretty showy local one. It's become quite rare locally as well, but Cherry Street has a really good population of these. Good for butterflies. The bossier as well, good for all sorts of little native bees, but it's a local pea, so it's a nitrogen fixer for other trees, shrubs and grasses that grow around it. And the salt bush is underneath those two. I'll just quickly highlight the one on the bottom right of the screen here, Plantago varia, a variable plantain. And it is a very interesting plant in that it has 2 butterfly species which rely solely upon it for its caterpillars. However, the local species of, the introduced species of plantain, Plantago lanceolata, actually acts as a host to the same butterflies. So in the fact that we've lost this species that you see in the photo here from many of our sites, there's some solace in the fact that the weed, Plantago lanceolata, which is now occupying most of the niches this used to, also forms a very similar niche. But that's not to say that we shouldn't keep this one, because biodiversity is very important. There's about 18 species of trees and shrubs on site. The 2 dominant species on this side are river red gum and swamp gum, but there's also yellow box, you can see to the right of the screen there, and the Studley Park gum, as you can see in the frame on the left of screen here. So they're the canopy species. The river red gum's by far the largest on site. It forms the highest canopy. There are 2 types of wattle on site, I would say, the short-lived types and the long-lived types of wattle. So these are 2 short-lived species, black wattle on the left and golden wattle on the right. The black wattle, I've put that frame in with a dead-looking wattle there because they're very important, not only when they're alive, but also once they've died. Black wattles, that black colouring is a very good indicator that this species is rich, high in nitrogen. They are very important nitrogen fixers in this system. They have the highest level of invertebrate activity of any local tree or shrub. Everything eats them or eats things that live in them. So the foliage is highly palatable for possums. The trees produce sap that sugar gliders eat. The roots are predated on by hawk moth larvae. The yellow-tailed black cockatoos come and rip them to bits to get the wood grubs out of the inside, the longicorn beetle larvae. There's all sorts of things that depend on the local black wattles. So very important species, dead or alive. If you see dead wattles, it doesn't mean that they need to be removed. They really need to stay there. They're a great habitat for all sorts of things and a great food resource. I've just included these 2 as the 2 long-lived wattles on site. On the left, you'll see these beautiful, big, tall, old examples of lightwood, Acacia implexit, the northern part of the reserve up near Greswell Hill at the back of the Springthorpe development there. They are a very long-lived wattle. So both those and the blackwood here, long-lived, they don't get the rots, they don't get the borers that the other species do. So not quite as important in terms of providing habitat for biodiversity in terms of insects, but still very important in terms of fixing nitrogen and surviving on site in quite harsh conditions. A couple of shrubs, pretty important to this site. Grey parrot pea on the top left there. Another one that's reduced its range considerably in this area of Melbourne. There's not many of them around. There's a few at Bundoora Park, a few at Greswell, and quite a few on site here. But just a lovely flowering plant, flowering now. Berseria, a very important summer flowering plant, which butterflies and birds rely on a nectar flow for. The one on the bottom left is a very interesting one. So it's something that generally occurs in the western areas of Victoria, out on the basalt, around the Grampians, places like that. But when a housing the housing development was built, and they put in a retirement village on the western edge of Cherry Street, and the soil was disturbed. This thing popped up, which was very interesting. So since then, we've been propagating it and growing it at the Trobe Wildlife Sanctuary from seed from 2 individuals which came up. Those individuals have since died on site, and I haven't seen one at Cherry Street since, but certainly the local genetics of that have been preserved at the Wildlife Sanctuary. So very interesting find, that one. And I'm not quite sure how it got there or how long it had been there for. The seed of that species can live in excess of 80 years in a soil profile, so pretty long life. It may have travelled there some other way, but we're considering it a local one. And the tree violet in the bottom right. There's a couple of parasitic plants which occur on site. There's a couple of, at least 2 species of mistletoe, and this cherry ballart, which you can see is a great food source for things like cockatoos, but other fruit-eating birds as well. And not to forget the local fungi. So fungi are very, very important. There are 3 types of fungi on site. There are things called what we call ectomycorrhizal fungi. So these are species which form relationships with trees and shrubs and even grasses, and they're very important for the growth of those species. There are other species called saprophytic fungi, which tend to rot down vegetation caught up in soil profiles, and then the wood rotters on the bottom. All very important. Just quickly go through a few things with the management of the site. So there are 3 basic processes that determine what happens in a grassland in terms of its floristic diversity, and that's basically nutrient, moisture, and fire regime, the most important being fire. So City of Darebin currently have a program where they intermittently burn small patches, or mosaic burn small patches within the Cherry Street grasslands to create a biodiverse ecosystem. It basically gets rid of the build-up of biomass from grasses and other small woody debris, and it allows a nice ash bed for plants to get in and germinate and grow actively with a nice load of nutrients as well. So here you can see basically a post-scorch area, very, very dense, diverse grass growth there, and no doubt interesting herbaceous plants growing in at the bases of them as well. Without this burning regime, you don't get enough space in between the tussocks for little herbaceous plants to germinate. We have issues on this site with some of the woody weeds. Most of them have been pretty actively controlled. This one, Cassinia sifton, up until fairly recently was not controlled, was considered a local native plant. Now we consider this a weed. It's been reclassified. It used to be under the banner of Cassinia arcuata, but that species does not occur on site, and this one is a New South Wales taxon, which we have been controlling fairly actively. This is the look that we're trying to achieve with all this burning, is this open grassy woodland. Without burning, we tend to get masses and masses of overstory and mid-story species germinating and growing up into quite dense thickets like this. In the early days, this site was traditionally a fairly dry site. The M Ward from Plenty Hospital, which was basically up the top near some of the very important remnant patches or open patches, was basically where they kept the kleptomaniacs and the pyromaniacs, and so had a very interesting history of being regularly burnt pretty much every year or every second or third year. So those areas tend to be the most diverse and the most open. As you get a reduction of this burning regime, basically we get the growth of trees and shrubs, and they tend to take over, and you get these really dense thickets that then need to be thinned. So Darebin have been working tirelessly on this thinning process, really trying to get it to a level where the understory is diverse enough to kind of look after itself. And basically you can see some nice sort of open grassy woodland areas there. This is the kind of look we're trying to achieve. In terms of threats, there's the predominant threat on this site really are weeds, and they can come in all sorts of different shapes and forms. From here we see a patch of vinca that is basically a leftover from the hospital era, when there were basically spoil piles all over the place that that had been dumped there, and plants that had been growing in gardens of their gardens and have now sort of taken off in this grassland. These areas tend to sort of stay fairly contained. We're worried about new and emerging weeds. This is a little patch of Dianella that was planted near the cherry streak grasslands, which has actually created an issue for management in terms of seeding into it and creating a genetic pollution with our local Dianella species, and so their hybrid offspring are becoming very difficult to tell from non-hybrid parent plants. Annual grasses, you can see a whole big sward here of Earhata, panic grass. So yeah, it's a big issue here. Darebin combat this by a number of different means, using burning, flame throwing, mowing, various other measures just to keep that seed load down. And finally, one of the other bigger threats is just the fact that it's in such close proximity to houses. So, you know, by being in such close proximity to houses, we need to have a fire break, and, you know, in mowing a fire break, you're creating an area that potentially is another edge, a larger edge where weeds can invade from the edge. Houses also present other issues in terms of cats and dogs, firewood collection, people building humpies. That photo is not from cherry streak grassland, but just as an example, you know, there are other local reserves where these sort of things have gone on, and it's created all sorts of issues in terms of removal of woody debris and disturbance of that ground flora layer. And as I mentioned with houses, they're pets. So cats and dogs can be an issue. Cats obviously predating on local wildlife, and you know, dogs more of a nuisance than anything, but certainly being able to spread diseases for local wildlife, and just the presence of cats and dogs in these sorts of sites can, you know, put animals on edge and change behaviours. Mowing is not too much of an issue. We need to mow areas. We need to create fire breaks and trails and paths and things. But, you know, in doing so, there can be disturbances such as soil disturbance. And when we get soil disturbance, we tend to get weed invasion. So, you know, we just need to be managing contractors, etc., in a better way with that. And finally, if you guys want to get involved, there are a few ways to do that with citizen science platforms. So eBird on the top of the screen there, eBird is an interesting platform in that you can go out to site with your phone. It will log your trail. You can put in all sorts of data associated with your sightings. You can upload photographs, etc. And you can look at any site, any local site, and see what has been recorded in the past. It's a worldwide thing, as well as iNaturalist. Both of those two things are worldwide. iNaturalist is another one where you can log all sorts of recordings from fungi and insects and any sort of plant, including weeds, any animals. You log it, you upload a photograph with what you might think is an ID, or you can ask for an ID, and then what happens is you get professionals that get on to these platforms and confirm your identification. This slide just quickly is straight out of eBird. I pulled it out this morning, and in the centre you can see cherry streak grassland with the strip that runs straight down the middle, that sort of green line you can see there. In the middle of it there's a little blue dot. That little blue dot is basically a diversity index for birds that have been recorded on site. And if you refer to the legend on the right of the screen, which you won't be able to see, it's too small, basically it says that there are around about between 15 and 50 recorded there. Now, I know there's a lot more there, so it just means that nobody's been recording. In the wildlife sanctuary just near there, we've got between 100 and 150 recorded. So the more people that walk through there and record the birds, the more data gets uploaded to these kind of platforms. And then once this data is on these platforms, it's accessed by various other management bodies as well, so they can see what's actually moving through the sites. This is just a couple of screenshots from iNaturalist. So the one on the left, Cherry Street, you can see all these green pins here. These are recordings of that somebody has uploaded of plants, and the pink ones are a fungi, essentially. Now, interestingly, you look at the picture on the right, that's Greswell Forest. Look how many pins there are, so many more pins. And, you know, probably that's because there's so many more people walking through there. But also, it's just about the sorts of the things that people know on site. So if you don't know that this app exists, then people aren't uploading. But if you're visiting Cherry Street Grassland, and, you know, if you're local, that is, or if you're coming from further afield once the restrictions are lifted, I would urge you to download iNaturalist onto your phone and just put these on. These things are great for future reasons. So, you know, whenever management are looking at diversity on site, it's a lot easier to pull this data out of platforms, etc. And yeah, that's basically my last slide. And the other thing I would suggest if you want to get involved is join a local friends group.
Thanks, Michael.
And that's it from me.